I was introduced previously, my name is Kathleen Fitzgeorge, and I, along with Donald McFarland and Rex Barrow and Jay Brazell, who you've already had met and listened to, have the privilege of representing Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Jimmy, would you stand up, please? Thank you. What you heard from the state attorney is what they believe or expect or hope the evidence will show. But it's a bumpy road because they haven't told you everything. The bulk of the evidence, the overwhelming evidence in this case, which I'd ask you to keep in mind, that evidence comes in the form of both physical evidence collected by the police as well as the testimony of the people who come in and talk to you. The people that, by and large, the police spoke to. And what you will hear is a lot of evidence about Mr. Wright and Mr. Sievers and their long-time relationship, decades long, that they were boyhood friends, known each other for decades. But I submit to you that the evidence will also show that they had quite a bizarre relationship. Although Mr. Sievers came out for the wedding, Dr. Sievers did not, for the wedding of Curtis Wayne Wright and Angela Wright. And it is alleged that it was during this time, on the wedding weekend of Mr. Wright and his wife, Angela Weidman Wright. And you will also hear that as a result of what the police learned from Mr. Wright and Ms. Schumacher is a story. But what they came up with was a theory. They came up with a theory. It's always the husband, must be the husband. It's not an unusual theory, it's very common. In fact, we hear all too much of it frequently. But we would ask you to listen for the flaws in this case, because there are many. And the evidence will show that the police spent a great deal of time and effort by law enforcement in collecting physical evidence and the testimony of witness, which came much later. There was a crime scene. The police were called by Dr. Petritis. The police and EMS arrived. They went in. The crime scene is where this crime actually took place. And the Lee County Sheriff's Department has crime scene technicians, pretty experienced, pretty good what they do, and they began looking at the scene and collecting the evidence. They took all kinds of blood. They swabbed everything they could for DNA, and they found a hammer. And I'll get to the hammer, which is interesting. They looked at it, they collected it, they analyzed it, they sent it to a variety of different labs, state, also privately held run labs as well. But none of this tells us very much. It provides some theories and opinions, but I would ask you to listen to all the evidence. Please don't form an opinion as yet. You've agreed to presume that Mr. Rodgers is innocent. We've asked each and every one of you to do so and to maintain that. But after they got this evidence, the police found themselves in a bit of a bind. It was a high-profile murder of a doctor, pretty young doctor, young mother. Sad, very tragic. And they had no leads as to any suspects. They had no evidence against Mr. Sievers, as Mr. Hunter said, sort of the perfect alibi. So they focused on after they got something. They didn't quite know what they had. They got something, and they focused on that. And the state will take a lot of time and effort in showing you how Mr. Rodgers and Mr. Wright drove to Florida to prove that they were here in Lee County. I'll tell you what, it was no secret. Not a secret at all. In fact, no effort was made to conceal the fact that they were coming to Florida. Mr. Rodgers took a little time off. It was coming up on just prior to the 4th of July weekend. Mr. Wright had asked him to go along, sort of a last-minute thing, just the day before. Mr. Wright wanted to leave on Friday, but Mr. Rodgers said, no, I can't get off work, I gotta work. So they embarked on this trip. Mr. Wright rented a car in his own name. They packed up lunch. Taylor Schumacher, who was at the time Mr. Rodgers' girlfriend, was packed up lunch for them. Mr. Wright picked him up. They had the GPS, and they got on the road. And it was Mr. Wright, you will hear from the evidence, who, he didn't take his phone, his personal phone. Now you'll hear that he frequently uses what they call burner phones, or commonly referred to as prepaid phones. Burner phones sort of implies that you're up to no good. You're doing something. You have this because they're not traceable. And he and Mr. Sievers had those phones. Mr. Rodgers didn't have a phone. He took his phone, his regular, old, normal, everyday, very traceable phone that Mr. Wright plugged into the GPS. Now, Mr. Wright, you will hear from the evidence, he's pretty tech savvy. He said a lot of things. At one point, he said that he was, he's got a couple of degrees in engineering. He works on computers. He develops software. He does works with cell phones that he installs and works on security systems as well. So he knew. He knew that Jimmy Ray Rodgers had his phone. You will also hear that from Ms. Schumacher that Jimmy Ray Rodgers was taking pictures on the way down. She saw those pictures when he got home. Taking some pictures, not concealing anything. When they got here, they went to the beach. All kinds of video surveillance up and down the beach. They went to Walmart. I would venture to say that just about nobody expects to go in Walmart and not be on some sort of video surveillance. They bought some items for the beach, for their stay here. You'll also hear that during this time that Mr. Rodgers told his boss, I'll be back on Tuesday. He talked to him while he was gone. I'm in Florida. I'll be back on Tuesday. Can't work until then. Took some days off. Mr. Rodgers' boss, who is not part of the company at Doe Run, we anticipate the evidence will show that Mr. Rodgers worked for a separate contracting outfit, owned JV Contracting, not for Doe Run, but he worked at Doe Run. And that they do, in fact, have these coveralls. They train their workers, the people they hire, but sometimes the training on people that work with the contractors isn't so good, and people take home the jumpsuits or coveralls, and frequently people use them to do other things like painting. It's not uncommon. Ms. Schumacher will tell you that Mr. Rodgers had brought it home occasionally to be washed. not necessarily knowing or realizing about the lead contamination at Doe Run. Ms. Schomacher will also talk about throwing this coverall out the window onto the road, and how she took the police out there to find that. Is this one that was in Florida? Is this what was taken? Why was it thrown out the window? It must be something really bad if it was, but I ask you to pay close attention to whether what that evidence shows matches up with what Mr. Wright says. As the state pointed out, he is the only person, allegedly, besides Mr. Rodgers and Dr. Teresa Sievers, that know what happened in that house. Mr. Wright will also tell you that it's very common for him to use all kinds of burner prepaid phones. And Dr. Petritis will tell you that it's very common for Mark Sievers to do the same. I'm not here to represent Mark Sievers, not in the least bit. I represent Jimmy Ray Rodgers. And what you will hear will show that he was not part of any conspiracy, and he did not kill Dr. Teresa Sievers. And you'll hear that, you will hear from Mr. Wright a lot of things. He made numerous statements, 8 at last count, starting with, I wasn't there, I didn't do anything. Moving on to, I don't know anything about that, must have been somebody else. Moving on to, well, I was in Florida, but I was outside, I didn't go in. I couldn't, I couldn't do anything like that. All the way up to, I took a hammer and I hit Dr. Sievers in the head numerous times. That's a big swing, no pun intended. You will hear a lot of things from Mr. Sievers that at the wedding, it was he and Mark, I'm sorry, for Mr. Wright, there's a lot of names in this, that at his wedding weekend, this man who is flying in from Florida to be his best man essentially usurped or stole his wedding weekend to talk about his life, and that Mr. Wright didn't know anything about that beforehand. And when asked about, my wife needs to be killed, do you know anyone? Mr. Wright said, no. He will also tell you how he couldn't commit for quite a while. He didn't really commit to doing this until such time as the burner phones were purchased. Then he committed because he had to do it from the kids, for the children, for these 2 young daughters who lost their mother, that he had to do it. But instead of hiring someone, he went along, and he said throughout his various statements, no, I didn't kill her, I didn't, but it was Jimmy Rodgers. So when he makes his ultimate statement to the police and to the state attorneys after numerous months of working with them, that he talks about, no, I couldn't do it. And they stop in order for him to realign his statement, shall we say, until it finally meets with, as the evidence will show, meets with their approval. And so he can get his plea bargain, and a bargain it is. But what you will find out is that Mr. Wright never told Mr. Sievers about Jimmy Rodgers, nor Mr. Rodgers about all his conversations with Mr. Sievers. Mr. Wright will claim that Mark Sievers controlled everything. He was controlling everything. He told me, what had to be done, when, where, how. He was very controlling. Except when Mr. Wright and Mr. Rodgers showed up here, he will tell you they had no plan, none. Not as to where it would happen, how it would happen, what item would be used. So when I talk about flaws, this idea of a hitman coming down to kill Mr. Sievers' wife is simply not true. There was no plan. There was no agreement as to compensation. Certainly none with Mr. Rodgers. Mr. Wright will tell you various things, that there was a plan that, Mr. Rodgers could come in and he could steal the coins that were there. That was going to be his payment. Oh, wait, no, it was antiques. Going to steal antiques as return for killing a woman. At one point it was, $10,000. So there's a variety of things going on here. So when you're considering credibility, consider the credibility of this one witness. And pay attention. There was absolutely no communication between Mark Sievers and Jimmy Ray Rodgers. None. At any time. Yep. Mr. Wright, the middleman, the puppet master, coming forward with a statement. As for Taylor Schumacher, the evidence will show that the police, however they were contacted or contacting her, she had made inconsistent statements as well, that the police were aware of what they had in Ms. Schumacher, an unemployed, uneducated, single mother of 2 at the time. We learned she was pregnant with Mr. Rodgers' child in 2015. We will hear that Mr. Rodgers was her protector in terms of physically, financially, and emotionally, until she hooked up with the police. That the police convinced her that Mr. Rodgers was guilty of this and that he would be put to death. They threatened to take away her children. They threatened to arrest her and charge her with being involved in this. And they told her that Mark Sievers and Jimmy Rodgers, not Curtis Wright, would both be getting the death penalty. So she shouldn't have to worry anymore. But most importantly, they paid her. They began paying her when she asked for money to give her statement. And they paid her money to put deposit down on a place to live because she had been living with Mr. Rodgers. And they gave her money for deposit and rent. They also gave her $400 a month, each and every month, paid by the Lee County Sheriff's Department, and has been receiving it and is still receiving it as her agreement in coming in to testify. They told her about $50,000 that she could be eligible for. So, again, judge the credibility of where it comes from. Most importantly, looking back at the evidence in the case of physical evidence, we would ask you to pay particular attention, because that physical evidence is wholly inconsistent with what Mr. Wright says happened entirely inconsistent. From the hammer to the injuries to Dr. Sievers. But it made a good story. Got him much lesser sentence. The evidence will show you that this was the independent act of Curtis Wainwright. If he was in conjunction with Mark Sievers, we don't know. We're not defending Mr. Sievers. But it will show that this was more of a crime of passion, perhaps produced out of rage, perhaps by someone who knew her, like Mr. Wright. The evidence will show that Mr. Rodgers is not guilty of conspiracy. He's not guilty of first-degree murder. So at the conclusion of this trial, I'm going to ask you to protect him. As a citizen of the United States Constitution.
Sustained.
As a citizen.
Objection.
Can I both sides approach for a moment? You ready? Yes, ma'am.
We talked to you, Mr. Brazell talked to you, Ms. Ross talked to you about the presumption of innocence. I'm asking you to follow that, which each of you promised us, and that Mr. Rodgers is cloaked with the presumption of innocence, and it's the state's duty to prove this case. That's the function of the American jury. We're here for justice today. I'm afraid there is no justice for Dr. Sievers. It was a tragic murder. But I will agree with Mr. Hunter when he misspoke and said Mr. Wright went berserk. He went crazy. And he had to correct himself to Mr. Rodgers. Thank you.